All right, so we got through the hard part, and that was poetry. So if you struggled, don't panic. That is just how it is with poetry. It is not everyone's cup of tea, and I completely understand that. But the cool thing about poetry is it lays the foundation for everything else that we cover in class, especially when it comes to imagery and the types of elements that we use in writing to show someone what it is we want them to feel. It's an incredible power. The reason why I start with poetry is because of how hard it is to say a lot in so little, just like in short stories. Short stories are my absolute favorite. Like I'm a poetry fan to some degree, but I love a good short story. Love it. Like this is why I think David Sedaris is probably one of my favorite authors, is because he just writes a bunch of satirical essays. And he's really good at it, by the way. So two things on that. One, humor is really hard to write. Humor very often falls flat. It is really hard to convey humor in writing. So if you happen to find an author who writes very well and is funny, God bless them, because that's a hard thing to do. So this is why I really appreciate David Sedaris, is his ability to do that. I also really like that he writes that in short stories. Just a really good tongue-in-cheek, kind of dry humory type of work. So if you haven't ever read David Sedaris, take a look at Me Talk Pretty One Day. That's the book that got me hooked. It is a little aged. There's some things where you're like, yeah, old white male wrote that. So just be mindful of that. But there are some parts to his work that I really do find, like, I recognize that it is hard to write funny. In fact, Sherman Alexie does a really good job too. He doesn't. Yeah, actually, no, he does write short stories. In fact, his Tonto and Who Have a Fist Fight in. Here we go. All right, so here's the one: The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven. Again, Sherman Alexie does a lot of satirical short stories. He's another really good one. So anyway, the reason why I say that is it's really hard to tell a story really like in a short amount of time and really convey the message. Um, if you are one who likes fantasy or like vampires and things like that, or sci-fi, you're not going to find short stories with that, especially if it's not a short story that's not like a fan fiction pulling from something we already have a basis for. If you're starting something new, to develop the setting, the characters, the dilemma, to create all that is too big for a short story. And that's something to be mindful of. If ever you do, y'all have, and you're all very talented, by the way. The short story, the snippets that you added to the hero's journey was phenomenal. So that being the case, you all should partake in submitting some short story work because it's good. That being the case, if you do, don't try and create something like and fan fiction's hard too because then you have to have an audience that understands the original work. So short stories will not be sci-fi. They're not going to be fantasy. They're not going to be genre-y. And it is really hard to write as a comedian in short story too. So that's why the works I'm about to give you for this coming up analytical review aren't going to be funny or satirical or fantasy. They're going to be what feels like real lived experience. And majority of the time, short stories are, well, actually, I'm not going to say that. I feel like that would be too overarching. I don't believe any of the stories that I give you are nonfiction. I believe they're all fiction. Consider that, and I'd actually have to do research. I just now thought about what the probability of short stories being nonfiction are. David Sedaris, his are fiction, but only because he's very liberal with the way he retells stories from his childhood. So he's had to be put under fiction stories. Anyway, let me see. I don't think any of these are nonfiction, or yeah, I don't think any of the stories I give you are nonfiction. Anywho, side note. Okay, so the reason why I say all of that is the goal here is when we're talking about short stories, we really want to break down, again, much like poetry, the elements of the writing itself. Okay. All right. I'm going to start with a quick history of short story. And it's as simple as the origins pretty much came from people storytelling traditions. That's pretty much majority of it. Very similar to poetry. Storytelling is very, it started, is oracle. Am I saying that right? Oracle? Why do I always group that word? Anyway, storytelling, right? Let me tell you a story. Pretty much every culture you can fathom has created storytelling as the way in which to tell history, to tell experiences. But the writing itself, the actual creation of literature, really didn't start coming around until more like the structure of it, till about the 19th century. So, like when we think of literature and we think of putting stories into something that is an actual story, like a storytelling, we have Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, my favorite is Wife of Bath. Yes, that's humorous. I think that's why I like it. Can you tell I like to be lighthearted when it comes to reading? I think that's right. Sometimes I have a hard time reading because it's so heavy. Y'all need to take me to a place that isn't real but short. And that's hard to do. Okay, so anyway, yeah, you could take a look at Aesop's Fables or another one. I don't have that linked in here, but you could look it up. Anyway, think about fables. Think about folklore, parables, these things that often are stories that give us a moral of the story. The lot of it is like when we think about The Boy Who Cried Wolf, things like that, parables and stories that give us a kind of a moral compass. When we think about like what's the purpose of a story is to tell us something. It's not just like poems, which were flowy, like initially flowy, and we're kind of like songs, and easy to remember. But a story wants to give us a purpose, wants to give us a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I looked down because I got my notes here. I'm gonna show you in a second. Okay, so that's really the origin of this. We're going to make this simple. You don't really need to know all the history, but have a general idea. Some of y'all probably have a much better understanding of, the origins of the short story than even I do. Because to be honest with you, the short story is a lot different than the epic. Remember we talked about the epic, which is something really big and long, and it's a journey, and it's a thing. Well, the short story, it's not. It's what do we got to say as best we can in as short as possible to make a point. Again, this is why the fables come through, the folklores. That's why we did it. Is again, we were trying to tell you something to the best of our ability without taking on a long ass journey to get you there. Okay, as I'm doing right now with my lecture. 19th century development. It mostly became popular, I guess you would say, in the 19th century in Europe and America. The idea, much like poetry, is to be contained, concise narratives that can be dealt with in like one sitting, where you can read it really quick, where you don't have to keep, coming back to it in the as like again an epic where you have to sit and read the whole thing. 19th century shit's starting to speed up a little bit. We got jobs, we got things to do. What do I know? But you know what I'm saying? Like things are really starting to ramp up, but people still want to read. People still want to hear stories. People want to be sat down and like read too. And sometimes these little snippets are helpful. In fact, I grew up with this book. Oops, 365 bedtime stories, and behind what this whole was, just these little tiny stories that my mom would read to me before bed. It smells old and I like it. Okay. Memories. Anyway, you could blame my mother. This is probably where my collection of books all came from, was because of her reading to me short stories. Okay. That being the case, the genre flourished in the United States with Edgar Allan Poe. We know his Telltale Heart and Fall of the House of Usher. Telltale Heart, everybody pretty much knows that one. It is an art. It's an art form. Again, this is why we do poetry and then we do short story, is because there's a lot of similarities between them. The idea behind it was, psychological depth, but narrative and narrative economy. In other words, how can you say a whole lot in a short amount of time? Okay. And there's an art to it. And it's really, to me, I'm absolutely fascinated by it. And I'll give you examples as to why. But if you want to take a look, I do have a couple links to a couple short stories here from the 19th century. We got Herman Melville, Kate Chopin, and then Nathaniel Hawthorne. Just some examples if you want to take a look at some more historical versions than what we will be reading. 20th century and beyond, again, we're talking about, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, just ums. I'm the best at the ums. Ernest Hemingway. There's a lot of different ways in which these authors are pushing both form, right, and matter, subject matter. Who do I have? Like when we talk about Hills Like White Elephants, when we talk about subject matter, some of you have already done this. Just as a heads up, if you've already done one of these particular readings for your approach, I would suggest trying a different short story. That would be my suggestion if you're going to be doing an analytical review. I wouldn't do do this one that you've done before. Sorry, I got distracted. I was trying to figure out where I was at. Anyway, so the whole point here is if you want to take a look, we also have more evolved short stories that include remember No Face, that Junot Diaz. He does the No Face. Lahiri has a few. Anyway, so that what we're looking for is themes, cultural diversity, shared experiences. Remember the different things in which people have experienced. With short stories, they obviously gain traction with magazines, literary journals. Some of you might know zines. I don't know if you've heard of zines before. Same thing, where it includes, smaller zines. Chico State, I don't know if you'd call it a zine, but it's where people will the Watershed Review. Take a look at the Watershed Review. If you enjoy doing the hero's journey and want to create another, really great creative story, look into what do you call it, the Watershed Review, and see if you want to turn something in to see if it gets published. You all are incredibly talented, so I'd highly suggest if you have the opportunity to go for it and try it. Okay. After the history, you see a whole list of the short stories that I'm going to have you work with for your analytical review. I put them here so that way if you haven't read them yet, you can go for it and give yourself some time. Again, if you've already done one of these works for one of the critical approaches, I would say do something else. Do something else. Hills Like White Elephants, that one everyone kind of beat to death. Maybe I'll take it off my list, to be honest with you. Try something that you haven't read before, and really push yourself to do something unique. Okay. All right. So first and foremost, we talk about the short story. Plot, plot, plot. What's the point? Why are we doing this? That's what we want to know. It's not writing just to write. It's to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay. When we talk, I don't have a whiteboard, so we're going to work with this. When we're talking about plot, our goal here is we want to make sure that we have, and I hope this isn't backwards for you, character development. This first beginning of your story, our goal here, where are we at? Who's there? What's the vibe, man? Where are we at? And also this is that part where we start talking about style and style of the writer. Okay, what's their style? What are we feeling? How are we, what's our tone? What's bringing us in? What's the feel? Okay, that's what all of this is right here. Character development, setting, tone. Let me see what other vocab words I got using here. Style, pace, point of view, right? That's kind of the big thing here. What's our point of view, right? Is it first person, third person? Like you tell me, right? What's going on here that helps us get to here, to the climax. In this spot, as we go up in this direction, we're going to end up with some type of conflict. What's the conflict? Oftentimes the conflict is, will they or won't they? Will they, won't they is usually it. Not the should they or shouldn't they, but will they or won't they? Okay, so as we go up here, this is kind of where the development of the conflict is. Something's going on. It starts to, more could be happening here. We're starting to get to a head. What's happening here? A good example would be Popular Mechanics. Popular Mechanics definitely gives you conflict. They're like in the middle of the conflict in media res. It instantly gets us into the tone, into the pace, into the plot line. Like we know within the first couple sentences of what is happening, right? And then takes us straight into the conflict. And then all of a sudden, we have this climax. And in Popular Mechanics, God bless Raymond Carver. Love his work. So good, but brutal. He's a dark man. His work is very dark. Climax, what happens here, right? What's that thing that changes everything from this to this? What happens here that changes absolutely everything? The characters, who they were originally, how they end up here, the setting, anything that changes is right up here. Okay, so what happens in Popular Mechanics? All right, that starts to bring us a resolution. Oddly enough, you might notice that sometimes right at the climax, it stops right there. Maybe we don't have a resolution, but we have a general idea of what happened based on everything before. Okay, and that's the cool thing about short stories. Sometimes, like again, you might notice that short stories have kind of like an ending that we can assume, we can kind of pretty much based on everything that happens, usually what the resolution is going to look like. It's rare you're going to see, you know how you watch a movie and like Legally Blonde, and at the very end, it gives like the context of every character and what happened to them after, and it kind of ties a little bow. In short stories, you don't get that. It's a short story. We're trying to get to the point and get out. That's kind of the goal here. Conclusions, or at least with the resolution, are often inferred based on everything else. That's something to consider when you were looking at these, especially with where was it? Popular Mechanics. When you're reading that and then you get to the end, let me double check. I read these so often, but I read so many things. I'm like, it does just end, doesn't it? Yeah, let me see. It is a very short one, so let me see what the last line is. Yes, there you go. The climax just ends. Okay. We can infer what happens at that point without much more being said. And that's the beauty of these short stories. That's why like Raymond Carver is so impactful with his work, is he says very little but gets to the point. I'm very excited to see what y'all come up with on your understanding of Popular Mechanics as we move forward. But it's just an example of that rising action and then the climax that goes, Link, what happened? Falling action is usually like, it leads to the conclusion, but sometimes the conclusion is just that peak moment. Okay, so for characters in short stories, there's usually not a lot of them. There's not a whole lot of development. Usually it's in a small space, a small setting. There's usually maybe only two it's a limited cast. There's not a lot of people. And the reason why is there is not enough time to develop an entire cast full of people to get to this point. It's short, sweet, simple. Tell it like it is and get us to this point. This is what a short story is trying to do, is just develop us enough to get there, but not create an entire novel. Okay. So the development of the characters is done in such a way that it allows the readers to understand their motives and their challenges, but in a very brief narrative. So the goal, and again with Popular Mechanics, I'm just going to go back to that one since we're going to stay on that one. We may not know a lot about the characters, but we know a whole lot about the characters because of the way that Carver creates these characters. The way he talks about their movement, even if just their dialogue is enough for you to go, oh, gotcha. That is the goal here in short stories, is that to be able to develop a character is quickly and succinctly, but also impactful enough that way that you feel it. Okay, like with Hills Like White Elephants, like we know Jig and we know her partner. We know that these two characters, in reading them, you can definitely feel the patriarchal slash feminist, like, there's a lot going on, and majority of the conversation is purely just dialogue. And that's the beauty of these short stories, is sometimes just the conversation alone can be enough. Sometimes just their actions and their movements. It's the imagery and the action that is so impactful, but without the author actually saying directly, but showing us through, again, actions and imagery. And those are the things I want you to look for as you do your analytical review. How are the characters being developed? How do we know what they're feeling based on the actions, based on the imagery? Okay. Characterization in short stories is usually very concise but rich as hell. It is deep. We're not flowery. We're not just like kind of, I don't know. We're like, this is the thing. This is what I need you to know because this is important, because this leads to that. Okay. Oftentimes the key, like, personality traits are shown again through action, dialogue, and internal thoughts. Like, we already know the characters because they're twitchy with their hands. They're always doing something where you can just feel the nervous energy, or the way they talk, right? Maybe the dialogue is like, oh, I don't know, but you could tell they're actually struggling on the inside of what is right for them versus what society thinks is right. Okay. How are these authors creating this characterization of these characters? Okay. Setting is also a really, really big part. Always sets the mood, right? It was a dark and stormy night. Like, you hear that so often. But what does that tell you when you hear dark and stormy night? We know. We know what we're going into when we hear that. In our poems, we've talked about, like, oftentimes cold gives a feel, warmth gives a feel, weather, where, like, are they in a suburban area? Are they in an urban area? Are they in the desert? Are they in the city? What's the setting? What's the time? What's the place? What's the atmosphere? Like, what is the author trying to tell us? Like, when we read, Heels Like White Elephants, instantly we know where we're at, we know what we're feeling, everything is given to you right off the bat, and then the rest is the dialogue that walks us through the situation that Jig is dealing with. So think of setting as the establishing of the mood and the context, right? Not always does an author make it rainy and cold for someone to feel sad. Hills Like White Elephants. It wasn't rainy. It was beautiful. They're on vacation. They're having a good time. But they set up the mood already from the beginning. You can already feel the uncomfortableness of the dialogue. Okay. Let's see here. Oftentimes, the setting will also play a pivotal role in influencing the plot and the characters' actions. Okay, when we talk about, let me get in there. I don't want that one. I don't want that one. I don't want that one. Sorry, I'm opening up different ones to see what I want. Popular mechanics. Let me see what popular mechanics. I'm telling you, I read these all so much that I have to remember what the atmosphere is like for all of them. I believe it was cold and stormy on that one. Let me see. There we go. So when we talk about popular mechanics, early that day the weather turned and the snow was melting into dirty water. We already know something pure is about to be tainted. We already know that the weather which turned is also the mood that turns from innocence to dirty water. Okay? That right there, that's how you instantly set your setting and already tell all the things. In fact, that whole line gives way for the entire story. That whole line right there told you everything you needed to know. It was not going to be a good day for the innocent. You know what I'm saying? For the pure. Anywho, okay, so think about that. Writers often use the setting economically to reflect the emotional tone or themes of the story. Just read it, just showed you. When we say the settings economically, what they're saying is they use they use the setting to tell you what you're going to need to feel versus other aspects, right? The setting is going to help you get to where you need to go in the story, so you already know before you even get into the actual plot of what it is you should be expecting. Again, just like Raymond Carver's Popular Mechanics, which by the way used to be a magazine, if you were curious as to why it's titled that, because Popular Mechanics literally has like, feels like it has no, like, why why is that the title of this particular story? Anyway, so just keep that in mind. That's the, if it's confusing to you. Same thing with politics. Politics is not about politics at all, not in the way that we would think of it now, right? Like, I know we got a whole lot of stuff going on in politics, we're gonna push that aside. Politics, when you read it, you're like, I don't, wait, what? And that's the whole point. Okay, so don't assume that the politics short story, which is actually maybe triggering, just, it might be. It's tough. It's, you never know the thing that's really going to get someone in the chest. That one might do it, but it's not in a political sense. It's a personal identity thing, and we're going to talk about that when we look at themes and contexts. Anyway, point of view, we got our first person, our third person, and omniscient. Okay. The first person is that character that's the I in the story, which means the character can only know what they know. They don't know what any of the other characters are thinking. And I is just I. I know nothing more than what I know and what I'm seeing outside. Sometimes that works really well. Prue, not Prue. Yeah, is it Prue? I know that Powder is a good one. Let me check Prue. Powder, I believe, does that. Let me see. Which one is Prue? Sorry, guys, I have so many things here. Prue. Nope. Prue's not one of them. I think it's Powder. Actually, Symphony. Symphony is a really good one for the I. Is it? Some of these writers do such a good job. Yeah. Powder is a definite first person point of view. So Powder would be one. I don't know, I'd have to look at some of the other ones. It's tough because they do such a good job oftentimes of doing like a third person limited that it feels like an I, but it is not. So anyway, Prue would have been, feels like a third person, but it's not. Or first person, but it's not. It's a third person. Anywho, first person, again, I, me, only me, first one. Okay. Third person is you're pulling out, you're outside of the story, but you're focusing on the character's thoughts and feelings. Okay. One character's thoughts and feelings. Third person's out here, but you're only paying attention to one person. And that's hard to do because you want to talk about all the characters, but third person is just literally the storyteller talking from this person's point of view. So the narrator to my story is third person. Omniscient. Wow, I totally said that wrong. Sorry. That is the narrator. That is the character. I'm sorry, the narrator that knows all the character's thoughts and actions. Okay, omnipresent, right? The all-knowing being. Okay, which is helpful because you can watch one character and be like, no, don't go in there, and you already know what's going on the outside. Sometimes that works really well. Sometimes it helps get you to where you want to go. Again, just like any single one of these points of views, it all just depends on what is going to be best to tell the story to give the right kind of feel. Short stories can be told from various points of view. The choice of point of view impacts how the reader connects with the characters and understands the events of the story. So what's important about Powder being from the young boy's point of view is it shows so limited and his view towards his father. And that's the important part, because if you have either a third person or, you know, even an omniscient type of, you know, point of view, that might take away from the power of it feeling like the reason why I love Powder from Wolf, I love his work. It feels like you are that character. It almost feels like it's a nonfiction, which is why when I come through some of these, I'm like, is it fiction or nonfiction? Tobias Wolff is hands down one of my other favorite short story writers, because he writes so well that, to me, there's times I'm like, is that real? Is that not real? Because he pulls the first person narrative. So oftentimes, if a first person can really come off as real and true, as if you are experiencing it, or you assume the person who wrote it experienced it, when it's not truly the case. So anyway, that's the importance of understanding what the power can be with these certain points of view, versus third person limited, where you can stand back and see what that character is doing, but still be very limited, or knowing all things. All right. Sometimes knowing all the things isn't going to get you where you need to go. So I don't know if that was supposed to be any kind of insightful statement, but anyway, so your point of view here is, which point of view are these authors coming from, and why is it important to the story? Why does it matter? Again, themes. Let's make sure that when we're talking about themes, we're utilizing the work to help us understand what these themes are, whether it's identity, love, alienation, conflict, or moral dilemmas. Moral dilemmas, popular mechanics. Love would be Powder, Prue, Symphony. Politics. Politics could be more like alienation. That could be another one for alienation. Conflict would also be popular mechanics to some extent. Love would be Symphony. Pet milk would be love for sure. Anyway, so think of these themes and how you know, based on what you're reading, that these are the themes. Is there symbolism and irony? Absolute. There's a lot of irony in politics. Pet milk also has a lot of symbolism. I don't know if it really has irony. Hills Like White Elephants definitely has a ton of symbolism, as we know, the white elephants. Prue, I can't really. What would we have for Prue? I don't know if irony would really work for them. Anyway, what are some things that are being used in these works that help in us understand whether the style, the language, what's symbolism and irony that is used in there. Well, again, when we talk about the style of a short story, oftentimes are they using precision and economy with their descriptions to get us to the point that we need to get to in order to get to the conflict, right? Carver is a really good job. Tobias Wolff does another good job. Tobias Wolff is not as succinct as Carver. He's a little more descriptive in the sense of, it helps us feel like we're there, as if we are the main character. That's the goal of what Tobias Wolff does, versus Carver, which pulls away but still gives us a lot of feeling. So when you're looking at the style there, what are you seeing within that style? Are they using super concise dialogue? Like, that's Carver for sure. He gets right to the point. And Tobias Wolff does the same thing, but he gives more when it comes to description. He gives us more of like a feel as we're in the truck, as we're sitting next to the father, right? Like, what are we feeling there? And you'll notice sometimes the succinctness, like with Carver, said a whole lot and very really well, and it was a bit shorter, versus needing to have a little bit more of the development of both characters and setting in Powder. Okay? How are you seeing the language tell us the story? Is it flowery? Is it more descriptive? Show us examples of what that means, and how it makes the story move the way it does. How does it help create a pace when you use certain language and dialogue? When we talk about concise language, we talk about the precise, essential details. Again, what is that one? Brain. Popular mechanics. Wow, brain. Good job. How popular mechanics is just straight to the essential detail, all the things that you need to know and nothing more. Here you go, right? Versus Powder, in which there are essential details that do matter, but it's not as concise and as succinct. We need those in order for us to understand the development of the character of the main I character, with his father in that situation. Okay. Okay. So hopefully I'm giving you as much as you need as we move forward. So again, we're going to think about common themes and contexts within these stories, very similar to how we did with poetry. Think about we have a human nature and conflict that can be themes in here. Let's see, what is human nature and conflict? Human nature and conflict would be popular mechanics, obviously, very much conflict, especially with human nature. You could say Hills Like Elephants does have a conflict, right? What's the conflict? We talk about masculine, patriarchal, societal norms versus the feminine, feminist, like self, I don't know if it's self-preservation. I don't know what you would call that, but you know what I'm saying. I'm trying not to give away the stories so that way you don't use my exact words when you go to write it. But you know what I mean? So when we're thinking about human nature and the conflict that comes with that, one person's wants and needs versus another person's wants and needs. We think of that, will they or won't they? Will jig or won't jig? That's the question. Do we ever get that conclusion? Right? And how do we know what the conclusion is? Based on the development of the story and the final actions. We think about isolation and alienation. Isolation and alienation, I think you could say No Face falls under that. Symphony, yes, but is that self-inflicted? Same thing with politics, self-inflicted. Maybe. You'll read it and you'll go, oh, okay, I get it. Okay. Social and political commentary. I don't know if I really have a lot of that in here, which is fine. I don't really think I have social or political commentary on these. Raven Carver's Cathedral. I guess I do have one in there. I'm debating on whether or not I want to keep that in there. But if it's on the link, go for it. So sometimes I do this and I decide later, I'm like, I don't want to use that in there. So I might take the Raymond Carver's Cathedral out since we're already using popular mechanics. Anyway, existential questions is another theme. I did originally have Kafka's Metamorphosis in there, but it's really long and it felt like it was just going to be too much. It's a great story. Go ahead and read it, but it's not going to be one of the ones we use for analytical review. I think existential, maybe Pet Milk, definitely politics, existential, popular mechanics. I mean, Hills Like White Elephants, Prue, Symphony. To be honest with you, in a way, maybe they all can have that as a theme. But don't reach for a theme out of guessing. Utilize the work and show me how you can say, yes, I know that this is the theme because of the following things that this story talks about. Okay. Don't forget, and when you're talking about these works, what are the historical and cultural contexts that could be influencing this particular story? I mean, obviously we know Hills Like White Elephants definitely has a lot of, hell, I'm wondering if social and political commentary, absolutely, with Hills Like White Elephants. I don't know if political would necessarily follow that. Anyway, when we think about the historical context, a lot of you used the historical context to explain why Hills Like White Elephants did what it did. Cultural context, again, what are the identities of the, maybe the authors or the things behind what they're saying? How does it influence maybe the author's understanding of the situation? It's rare you're going to find like a man writing a story from a female's point of view and pull it off really well, or vice versa, right? When I often say, especially in my creative writing classes, don't write from what you don't know. And you'll see a majority of these writers write from what they do know. And that's the thing you want to consider as you're looking at the historical, cultural, and personal context. How might those be influences into what the writers are talking about? So, okay. And again, contextual influences on style. The brevity of a short story often leads to tight, focused prose. Prose meaning the actual work itself, with each sentence serving a specific purpose. Each sentence serving a specific purpose. That very first line in Popular Mechanics absolutely, absolutely does that. Okay, again, that's why Raymond Carver is Raymond Carver, because he does what he does. That is something I want you to be mindful of when we're looking at influences on style. Writers often work with fewer characters and settings to make every detail significant. In Powder, we know of the mom. We understand her personality. We never see her. We have no idea what she looks like. We've never heard her voice. We know nothing of her other than the succinctness in which Tobias Wolff gives us what we need to know and only what we need to know and nothing more. Okay? So when we think about that, think about what it is in these sentences that makes it impactful and why that was used. Not breaking down the entire story, but again, that first line in Popular Mechanics, why is that so impactful? Okay. Short stories can also be a means of experimenting with narrative techniques such as, maybe a stream of consciousness. I don't include any of those works in this one. Maybe an unreliable narrator. First person is usually the most unreliable narrator because it only knows what it knows based on what it sees, right? So sometimes they do that. Or nonlinear time structures. Often when I write stories, I do nonlinear, especially if it's a nonfiction, because I don't know how to tell a story from beginning to end. I have to write it in media res, where I start in the middle and then I kind of bounce back and forth to kind of, get where we need to get, but without having to do that whole timeline. Non-linear is not how I write. Or linear is not how I write. I write in non-linear. I bounce around. Are there works that you're seeing here that do that? Okay. I don't think you do. But if you want, you can take a look at Virginia Woolf's Haunted House and see what they've got there. So anyway, hey, not bad. Only 42 minutes. A lot of that's because majority of the stuff that we've talked about with imagery and things we've already done with poetry. You don't need to know a whole lot of too many details because majority of you already understand plot, settings, point of view, and all that stuff. Majority of it is really recognizing within the works, how are you applying these particular themes in it? What are you seeing in the works? The hardest part, I would say, is understanding style in language. The best way to talk about style is to talk about the language that's being used. How is the writer writing this book? How are they telling the story? That's going to help you understand the style. I'm when I continuously compare Popular Mechanics to Powder, it's because of that exact reason. We've got the succinctness of Carver versus the need for detail from Tobias, right? Tobias Wolff, Wolff versus Carver. Anywho, I'm not saying that you're going to be synthesizing your work and comparing one to another. That's not the goal here. The goal here is just using the language from the writing and the work that you chose and using examples from the writing to show me your understanding of their style. Okay, so anyway, when you start doing your analytical review and you start doing research, you're probably going to find some answers to some of the questions you might have as you read. But your main goal is to read it and try and figure out your understanding of the themes. What's that plot, right? What's that look like? How did they do character development? At what point are you seeing that conflict and that climax and a resolution? What's popping up from that, Anyway, so go for it. Enjoy. Message me if you have questions. Again, the history, I give you a lot of examples. It's not something that I'm going to beat into your head, right? But it is something to understand as we move forward in short story. So anyway, that was all. Message me if you have questions.